Well, this session is going to be on offers, contracts, and closings. And just this whole series has been amazing. So we're really excited to wrap up with this one.
So, Don, I believe you're going to take the first section if you're ready to go.
Yeah. So, okay, program overview. We've been through that. 9 steps of these business sales. Okay. And everywhere from starting the exploration to post closing, you'll see we're diving in really at the 5th step, which is the offer phase. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that from a buyer's perspective, they've been looking at a business, they found it, they inquired about it. Don Hobbs is the listing agent. We've engaged with Don. We've started doing our homework, and we're doing some due diligence really on the front end leading up to our desire to put together a letter of intent and offer. So let's dive right in. What is a letter of intent? Okay, it's a written non-binding proposal that outlines an agreement in principle between 2 or more parties before a legal contract is finalized. I promise you, we're not going to kill you with death by a PowerPoint today. You're going to get a copy of all of this at the end. Here's the short version. It's 2 to 3 pages. It outlines the business terms of a proposed transaction. And at this phase, attorneys really aren't necessary. I mean, they could be involved, but they're not necessary because we're not building a legal contract together. Okay, so buyers, before you make the offer, all right, know your resources and your capabilities, and be prepared to provide evidence to the seller that you've got access to the capital, that this business is the correct one for you, that the timing and the motivation behind why you want to buy this business is correct, that the characteristics of this business line up with you, the buyer, and your buying profile. You're selling yourself to this seller, believe it or not, because especially the good businesses, you're going to be in line with a handful of other folks that also want to acquire that company. And you've got to be able to articulate why you're the one. Okay, good buyers, again, we got to be prepared. Sometimes buyers think, hey, I'm just going to put an offer in here early and try to lock this down I'm doing them a favor by that's not how it's viewed. We're not doing anybody any favors if we come to the letter of intent stage too quickly, uninformed, right? And it's Don and I's job as listing agents to help you avoid that. So keep in mind that the seller is parting with their baby, right? That they're parting with the lifestyle that they've created, schedule, income, etc. They've got customers, external customers that are paying the bills, internal customers that are helping run the show. That's important to them. They don't want to just hand that over to anybody. Community ties, right? I mean, we're talking small business here. Most of these are, up to 5 million, up to 10 million is really the general range that Don and I play in. But they're involved. These owners are involved. So we want to be respectful through the process from a buying standpoint. We want to communicate. That is going to be your friend. For example, if you put together an offer that's less than asking price, help the broker or the seller understand why. Give them some of the why as to why maybe you're valuing it differently. Those types of things will help keep you in the game versus being dismissed from the process. Sellers need time to review the offer. Okay, and so sellers don't like situations where they have a buyer come in, they may not have spent much time, they want to put a letter of intent, and oh, by the way, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we need you to make a decision in 24 hours. That doesn't go down that way. They're going to want to review typically multiple offers, and they're going to want to hear the sellers from the market. What's the market think about my listing? Does it like it? Does it not like it? What's it doing to the value, etc. So your buyers, your relationship with the broker is important. It's important through this process. Deals move at the speed of trust. Let's talk about the components of a letter of intent. Okay, here's just quickly the basics. We're setting expectations many times, and really every time. I don't know why it wouldn't occur this way, but buyers, I'll just use myself as Don and I are in the same boat. But I'm building a relationship with the buyers because I need to know what they need to know so we can help them through the process and figure out if they're the one. Okay, and often they're going to come to me before they draft a letter of intent, and they're going to ask me like, look, based on what you know about these sellers, this is what I'm thinking, right? Here's some high level terms. Do you think this is going to fly? So a couple quick things. Number one, Don and I don't set the price. The sellers are ultimately going to make the decision on yes or no. And you'd be surprised to know it's not always the highest price. But run it by us, because what we are well aware of are the hard no's, and we'll help you understand that before you spend time putting a letter of intent together. It may or may not keep you in the game. Let's get rid of the loose ends. But the formal LOI is going to be signed after it's cleaned up and submitted to the buyer with broker assistance. Okay. Here's some example terms that you'll find in a letter of intent. Again, you'll get a copy. I won't read all this to you, but what we're going to do here next is build a letter of intent together. So it's going to start here on your offer, price and deal type. Okay. It's the total consideration being offered for the business. Dollar amount's the easiest way to look at that. Okay. Common deal types, structure. Well, what kind of structure are we offering here? Asset acquisition, stock purchase. Is it a membership purchase agreement? Could be any of those. Asset purchase, by the way, is the most common that we see. Earnest money. Okay. So that's going to come by way of a flat dollar amount or some percentage of the purchase price. Sometimes sellers are real particular about that. Other times, Don and I are involved with buyers, and we understand some of the economics of the buyer behind the scenes, but it's usually going to be one of those two things. Those funds are going to be held in escrow, so they don't go to Don, and we don't hold them. It's likely going to be the closing attorney that has escrow capability who's going to hold that. But it's demonstrating your proof of interest and your ability to access capital to buy this business, and it's typically refundable at this phase. What is your funding strategy? Okay, the money in these deals really comes from three places. They come from the buyer, right? Their equity injection, some sort of cash that they're going to be providing at closing, plus the earnest money that they've already put forth. That's going to count towards their purchase. Somewhere in that 10 to 30% range is pretty standard. The lender, right? Lenders are part of 90+% of our deals, right? Cash buyers, all cash buyers are very rare. Or the seller could participate in essentially the funding strategy for the business by some way of a seller note. So let's talk about the timeline behind these transactions. Okay, so we're starting at the point where the buyer and seller, for all the right reasons, have come together and we're signing the letter of intent. And then that letter of intent is going to outline our ability and sort of the rules of the game to get to the purchase agreement. So I just want to restate, don't submit a letter of intent that you don't fully intend to execute on. And Don and I will help you if you're a buyer, help you make sure that that's the case. It's not doing anybody any good. Are there times where deals fall through in due diligence? Absolutely, right? But we want to make sure we're serious about it. That purchase agreement is typically 30 to 45 days. 30 days is quick, but 30 to 45 days from the time that we sign that letter of intent. And due diligence needs to be completed, right? So it's factoring that part in as well. That due diligence timeframe is very similar to the purchase agreement dates in this process. And then ultimately, it's going to drive us to closing. So the letter of intent drives us to a contract. And then the contract has a bunch of checklists that are driving us to closing. Transition and training. Okay, so what is the buyer asking for in this purchase? What are they asking from the seller? Do they just need training of a certain type? Maybe they actually need some consulting help or management services at some level. That'll be addressed in your LOI. What's the duration? How long is this training transition time going to take, right? Is it on site at the office or at the building? Is it remote? Maybe it's a blend of the two. We're going to build that together here in a little bit. We see that buyers ask for a lot. They want to have their hand held. They're trying to mitigate risk. It's understandable. That'll be balanced out by talking to your broker and hearing from the seller. And what we find is a lot of times their initial request of maybe some really long period of training and transition can be shortened. the better we are at helping do the due diligence process and being transparent and getting people information to make well-informed decisions, we find we can really shorten that time frame between buyer and seller. Exclusivity is a big question, right? What does this mean? So first of all, it provides the buyer with an unobstructed path to make the deal happen. It's broken down one of two ways. Sometimes you'll have from buyers will have full exclusivity, right? That's more rare than common. Where literally they sign a letter of intent, they provide their earnest money, and then no one else can talk to any other buyers. Everything is on hold until this letter of intent is either terminated or expired or goes to a purchase agreement. What we see more is partial exclusivity, where a buyer will come in and really what's exclusive is the seller cannot sign multiple letters of intent, okay? So they've accepted your LOI. We're going to work on those terms with you. But what's happening in the background is people are still inquiring about this business, and they're still able to ask questions and gather info and put backup offers together. Again, the seller's not able to accept those during your LOI timeframe. Those are just quick examples of exclusive versus non-exclusive timeframes, okay? And as with any deal, everything's going to come with an expiration deadline. These don't go on in perpetuity. So now we're in the due diligence section, okay? Well, how are we proposing handling that? This is really where the buyer's looking under the hood, very engaged with Don. Don's engaged with the seller, gathering information. It's a tremendous information flow, okay? And depending on how comfortable the seller and the broker is with the buyer and their level of seriousness and their ability to execute, some buyers might get access to a little bit more information. So that's all determined on how prepared you are and how well you're presenting yourself in this process, okay? But due diligence needs to outline the requirements. What do you as a buyer really need? And we're going to ask you to put that in writing. Give us a list. This is not an open-ended review like we talked about. So there's going to be a time frame associated with it. And this is probably the most important part to pull from here. This is an opportunity to validate material facts, right? That will help you as a buyer make a go or no-go decision. This is not a time for a buyer to come in and say, open-ended questions, just constant, like I simply just always need more information, or I want you to teach me how to run this business that I haven't purchased yet. It's not going to happen, okay? The buyer has reasonable time to complete their due diligence, and the seller is also in the background determining the buyer's ability to execute on this letter of intent and ultimately the purchase agreement.
Hey, Don, if I could jump in really quickly.
Yeah, please do.
We have a question from Justin. He wanted to know if earnest money is provided at the mutual execution of the LOI or at mutual execution of the APA. Justin, we'll talk about that a little more, but there usually is earnest money at the mutual execution of the LOI. And as Don has pointed out, it's a non-binding offer, which means it's fully refundable because that LOI can be terminated by either the buyer or the seller at any time for any reason. And so the earnest money tends to be refundable. However, it carries that, as Don was just talking about, it shows there's access to capital and seriousness on the part of the buyer. I'll talk a little more about earnest money at the APA level when I get to the purchase contract. So stand by for that, Justin.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Don, for tackling that. So here's some examples of required contingencies, things that need to happen for the deal to go through. Financing. If financing is involved, absolutely going to have lender approval. If there's a landlord involved, well, we're going to have to get landlord approval and be able to execute a suitable lease before closing, actually. And we can touch base on that too. Obtain special licensing. So let's just say it's a plumbing business, right? And maybe it's a financial buyer like myself, meaning I'm not a licensed plumber. I can still buy that business, but I'm going to have an answer for that license requirement. So I'm going to need some time. Is it a key employee I need to retain? Is it a partner I need to bring in? How am I going to address that license requirement? And then if there's franchisors or suppliers or distributions agreements, those things have to be sorted out too. There's got to be a path for that to be cleared. Some optional contingencies would be key employee retention. That may or may not apply. Same with the non-compete. Most people want them, but they're not always involved. Obviously, the buyer is going to need to be satisfied with the books and records, but they may not necessarily put that in the LOI. That might just be handled through the process of due diligence, etc., or material changes in the business. All of these pieces are negotiable. All of them mean something different to everybody. Just a couple examples for you. So let's go back to building our letter of intent. Okay, so knowing all of that, here are our deal points for that $1 million business. So we're proposing the payment goes down this way. The buyer's going to bring $200,000 in cash. Okay, they're going to get an SBA loan for $725,000, and they're asking for the seller to provide a seller note for 5 years at 7%, 75 grand. And so that's where our $1 million is coming from. And they're saying LOI for 10 days, that's to Mr. and Mrs. Seller. I'm going to need a signature within that time frame to make this work. And once that LOI is signed, okay, and now we're working on that together, within 45 days of that, we'll sign a purchase agreement. Okay. And then within 60 days of signing that purchase agreement, we'll close. That's my proposed time frame. Here's how we're outlining the training: some on-site, some remote training, and then some extended time where, hey, I just need you to be able to answer your phone and provide some coaching if I run into some things that are unforeseen after we're done with our initial training phase. Now we're addressing exclusivity. We're asking that the seller won't sign another LOI before this one expires or is canceled, like Don said, between the two of us. Or maybe it's extended because everybody likes everybody and we can all tell we're putting our best effort forward, but we're going to need some more time. That's usually extended, friends. I mean, as long as everybody still feels the way they did at the beginning and we're demonstrating that we're working hard and doing what's being asked, it's likely it's going to be extended. Or even better, we actually got our purchase agreement signed, which Don's going to cover here shortly. Due diligence. So here's our key points on due diligence, which we need to satisfy in order for this to go through. And then what are those contingencies? We just touched on some of those, required and optional. I've got to get a loan for $725,000. SBA likes me, but if you've ever been through that process, you'll know there's like 5 approvals you're going to get from beginning to end. So Don, the broker, is going to be paying close attention to that, making sure that that continues to track. Got to get a lease. I've got to make sure the books and the records validate, right? I know you told me this. Now I'm going to validate them, make sure we're good. There's no material changes, but I am asking for a 5-year non-compete 50-mile radius for you to not compete with this business directly. And just a quick note on non-competes, very quickly. Buyers are going to have an opinion. The lender's going to have an opinion too. If you get an SBA loan, great news. They're going to have requirements for that to help support you and protect you. Okay. So sellers in this process, remember a few things. All of your offers and buyers have their own strengths and weaknesses. Everybody's going to be different. And that's why, friends, that sellers are going to want to evaluate multiple offers at the same time. I mentioned earlier, it's not all based on price. That's true. They're looking for the strength of buyer, the fit on many levels, not just how much money can be written. Identifying what's important to you, the seller, such as timeliness, price, the clean exit, your employees, all these different pieces of the puzzle. It's more than just money. It's always a process of negotiation. It always is, right? And that doesn't mean, wrestle somebody down and try to squeeze them for a little bit more. I negotiate traffic when I drive to Denver. I just want to get from point A to point B safely at a certain time. That too is negotiation. We're going to navigate some things together to get there. It's going to take compromise by everybody. Again, deals move at the speed of trust.
Great. Okay. Well, that was letter of intent. Couple things I just want to reference that Don made, because they're going to be so important to a successful contract stage. And that is the purpose of the letter of intent. Imagine if you got a letter of intent and it said, I will pay you $1 million for your business. Signed, Bob. Right? What is the chance that that is going to be successful as an offer, or that the seller is going to want to move forward on that? No, the seller wants to know what is really on the table from this buyer and who is this buyer. And I think Dawn has done a fantastic job of giving us that kind of information. All those deal points, those slides about the deal points that talked about payment and timeline that the deal would move forward. There's a huge difference between I want to close this business in 60 days and I want to close this business in 180 days.
Right.
If the seller doesn't know that, how do they handle that? Training. I need you to be around for 2 or 3 days to show me how to run the point of sale system and, where I turn the lights on and off and those kinds of things, versus I need you to work in this business for a year. I mean, these are big
Absolutely.
differences. And letter of intent is the location, the time to get these business terms down. You'll notice Don didn't cover anything on legal things. That's all going to happen in the contract. But exclusivity, due diligence, what are the contingencies? Getting those down at the letter of intent, which, by the way, is really written in plain English. It's why you don't have attorneys. Attorneys can't write in plain English. But that's what you want a letter of intent to do. Just explain what's going on here. So the letter of intent, Don took us through it. There is one buyer chosen. The letter of intent is negotiated and signed by both parties. And now we're moving forward. We're going through the due diligence and we're developing the contract. The contract is the next stage. So Don, let's look at that. They're called purchase agreements, contracts. If the LOI is the non-binding intention to purchase, yet it still contains all of those important business items that Don was talking about, the purchase agreement is the binding contract. This is where everything becomes legal. And we talked about that. Asset purchase agreement is the most common structure. I'll explain that really quickly for people for whom they're not familiar with that. So most businesses, there is an LLC or an S corporation or a C corporation that is a business entity registered with the state, and that's the business entity. And underneath that is the operating entity. That's all the ways that the business happens. Those are the physical assets that are part of the business, the intangibles like the website, all those operating things, your leases, and all of that. When you do an asset purchase, you buy all of those operating components, but you don't buy the stock in the company or the entity itself. You only buy the operating components of that. And that's called an asset purchase agreement. And with small businesses, that is by far and away the most common. So that's the example we'll use today. But I wanted to make sure you had a little background on the difference between asset and purchase. Okay. Let's look at an asset purchase agreement, or APA. It's legally binding. And I use an example that's relatively recent for those of you who followed it. Elon Musk put out a contract, a binding agreement to purchase Twitter. Then he changed his mind. He said he didn't want to. What did the courts do? They forced him to acquire Twitter at the price that he had put in the contract. He was not able to renegotiate that. So it is a binding agreement. When buyers and sellers enter into a contract or purchase agreement, it's binding. And attorneys are involved. Yes, you definitely want an attorney. Typically, attorneys are acquired right after the LOI because you need to develop the purchase agreement in concert with your attorneys. And so they get involved immediately following a letter of intent. Oftentimes people have identified their attorney ahead of that, which is great. Purchase agreement. We say it's the playbook for the transaction. By the time you're done with a purchase agreement that is signed by both parties, it is everything that is going to happen to make that transaction come to a close. So it's the rule book, the playbook for the transaction. And it tends to be about 10 to 30 pages and may also have exhibits that go with it. So, you know, it's much more detailed than that 2 or 3 page LOI that Don was talking about earlier. Now, before an APA can, let me look here. I've got Brian Green has a question. I'll just answer it. Brian wants to know if the SBDC has an LOI type template. No, but if you contact either Don Taylor or me after the program, and you'll see our contact information, Brian, we will be more than happy to provide you with information about a good LOI. Templates are a little hard to produce because they're very different. They're all different in a lot of ways. But what content needs to be in, what we provide you will really reflect what we were talking about today. And it's just an outline of those things. Okay, before a purchase agreement can get signed, during that due diligence period and when it's being developed, the buyer has some tasks that they need to get done. So these are going to lead to the ability to have a final version of a purchase agreement, but you'll need to make sure you have confirmed your lender and loan commitment. At the LOI level, you might have outreach to 3 lenders, and we might, as brokers, have contacted those lenders to make sure that you're a viable candidate for financing, but you may not yet have chosen who that lender is going to be that you're going to work with. You're going to need to do that before you can get a purchase agreement signed, because we're going to want to put in there the money is coming from this lender, not just that the money is coming. You're going to need to confirm the assignment or a new lease with the landlord. Prior to a purchase agreement, you need to have gotten with the landlord, and we should be able to confirm how you're going to take possession of that real property. Is that going to be an assignment of the existing lease, or is it going to be a new lease? Keeping in mind that if you also have an SBA loan, your terms for that lease, the duration of that lease, are going to need to be consistent with the terms and duration of your SBA loan. The SBA is not going to forward money to you if you don't have a right to occupy a physical premise at some terms that are acceptable. You're going to need to establish a business entity. We talked about in a purchase agreement, you're acquiring the assets, not the entity. You'll need your own entity to put those under. And that might be one that you already have, or it might be a new one, but you need to make sure you've got that in place. And there are other contingencies. We talked about them earlier. If there's anything else that was in that LOI that is a contingency, you're going to resolve those. They're not always going to get done. Some may carry over into the purchase agreement as ongoing contingencies, but the goal is to resolve as many as possible.
Don, there's another question in the chat.
Yeah, okay, good, thank you. Same question for the APA. Is there any sort of boilerplate starting point similar to the Colorado contract to buy and sell real estate? So really interesting, Michael, that you've asked that question. No, there is not. There is no boilerplate provided by DORA, Colorado DORA, which is where that comes from, the contract to buy and sell real estate. However, most brokerages have gone out. They have developed contract templates through attorneys, because a brokerage could never write its own contract, but attorneys are involved to develop that for them, and then the brokerages have templates that they use. Also, a lot of these transaction attorneys on the buyer and seller side, they have developed their own contract templates that they like to use. So there's a variety of ways that it happened. You can contact us, Michael, afterwards, and we'll be happy to talk a little more about that. But that's the information on that.
Question.
Okay, good buyers. What do you know? Good buyers know that when you put that letter intent together and you've said, I intend to pay $1 million and I'm asking for a $75,000 seller note, et cetera, good buyers know that you're not going to come to the purchase agreement stage and just, unilaterally decide you're going to lower that price to 900,000 unless you can point to material issues that came up during the due diligence process, and you make your rationale known to the seller. I am lowering the price because. And so if you were to make a unilateral change, it's called a retrade. It's very common among strategic or other buyers that we don't have very many positive things to say about. Because it's really going to change the tenor of that deal. Good buyers also know that the LOI was probably a 97% certainty that you were going to move forward with the transaction, assuming the contingencies could be met and the material facts were there. When you get to a purchase agreement, we're going to bump that up to 99.99% certainty that that deal is going to the close, because the purchase agreement, again, closes most of the doors on contingent elements and other potential problems. And it says, this is what's going to happen in this transaction. So those due diligence and buyer advance prep tasks, they are completed at this point. And we say again, deals continue to move at the speed of trust. We will repeat that and repeat that. The parties need to feel like they can work together and they understand where the other party is coming from. Transaction of a small business is not a win-lose. It's a win-win transaction. It has to be. And if there's any loser in this, the deal just simply doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Okay. Mark Spurgeon has asked common reasons for retrading price and terms. You've encountered something that's a material fact that you did not know. You did not know that there was some kind of liability or lien against the business or some problem that was going to affect it. You didn't know that the taxes are significantly different from the P&L. You didn't know that this is a business where the supplier was not going to transfer the business to the new owner. Let's say it's a bicycle shop that has Specialized, and Specialized has to approve that. And they found out that they weren't. And so now this bike store is going to have to go forward as a bike store, but without Specialized as a brand that it can carry. It might still be worthwhile buying the business, but it might not be worth the same thing. If the retrade is simply based on the fact that the buyer wants to try to get the business for less money than they originally said, that's a negative. That's just never going to go through. So, Mark, those are some things that I could mention. So what might change from the LOI? We talked about earnest money a minute ago. So let's say there was a $10,000 earnest money escrow put in place. At the contract stage, we might make that $25,000. So we're adjusting the amount. Or certainly we might make it non-refundable, or what we call hard money, meaning, okay, now there's 10,000 in, but you're not getting it back, buyer, once you've signed the purchase agreement if the deal doesn't go through. Those kinds of changes can happen. Contingencies are typically reduced, although it's really common all the way to through the transaction to have a contingency about being able to occupy the space, being have a contingency about material changes. Things can happen in the business. And another example of a material change might be the largest customer decides to terminate services, and they're 15% of the revenue for that particular business, that one largest customer. You know, that's a material change, and the buyer could see that as a rationale to lower the price. Financing, you know, instead of just saying buyer will get financing, we're going to add the proof of that lender commitment. And we're going to demonstrate that those things are in place. So we might be adding more detail to the loan and lender requirements. We might be adjusting the timeline for practical realities. We learned that there's something going on that causes this to be pushed back 15 days or 30 days or 60 days. Maybe somebody got sick and they're just unable. Maybe the buyer is coming from out of state and can't relocate. They're really serious about buying it, but they could not relocate as quickly as they needed to. And so we take that into account. So long as the business is still moving forward, the transaction's moving forward, those adjustments can happen. Exclusivity, we talked about, you know, at the LOI stage, there's still a tremendous amount of risk for the seller. Sure, there's an offer. Sure, there's a buyer who we have faith in. There's some trust there and all those things. But that buyer can walk for any reason. We're not going to take it off the market at the LOI stage. But when we get to the purchase agreement, yeah, maybe we'll just terminate all visibility of that business being for sale, and we'll stop talking to other people. And that's more reasonable at the contract stage than it is at the LOI stage. Transition support, depending on what the buyer has learned and the seller has learned, those asks that were put into the LOI, maybe they need to be expanded, or maybe they need to be reduced, or maybe they need to be modified. Why? Because the buyer has learned a lot more about the business than they knew at the time they made the letter of intent, and the sellers learned more about the buyer. And there'll be exhibits added. There might be various documents that are added to solve legal things. P&Ls are added as exhibits to it. Taxes are added. W-2s for owner salary are added. Benefit plan programs are added. So those are all things that that will happen as a purchase agreement is put together. There's also going to be a desire to make some financial adjustments and settlements. Don, I think that's on the next slide here.
Yes, sir.
So there's going to be, let's say you're a wedding venue and you've taken lots of deposits for upcoming wedding programs that you're going to be running. How are those going to be divided? Those are not seller revenue. Those are deposits being held. So you'll need to make financial adjustments for things like that. The cash on hand, typically in an asset purchase agreement, seller keeps all of the money in their bank account. That'll be specified in the purchase agreement. That's what you're going to be doing. If, however, some of that cash is going to transfer to the buyer, and it can happen, you know, that needs to be specified. Accounts receivable. Some businesses, you know, restaurants don't have accounts receivable. They cash out every single night. But some businesses, manufacturing businesses, distributors, things like that, they're going to be paid for products that they've delivered earlier. You need to account for how those accounts receivable are going to be dealt with. And typically, that's money that's going to flow to the seller, even though it's going to happen after closing. Accounts payable. Is the seller going to take care of all accounts payable up to closing, or are some of those going to transfer to the buyer? We just need to be specific about that. Transfer of seller deposits. Seller might have money in with the utility company, might have money in with the landlord, might have money in with the phone company. All of those types of deposits, what's going to happen with them? We're going to want to do that. And prorations. Prorations are things like rent. If you close in the middle of the month, but rent is paid in advance, that means the buyer's going to get the benefit of rent that's been paid by the seller. Typically, that goes back to the seller at closing in the form of a proration. Same for advertising. Maybe there's website hosting. There could be a number of different types of expenses that are paid in advance. And there could be other ones that are paid in arrears. So the buyer would have to pay costs for the business when the seller still owned it. So that would be a situation where that flips over and the seller compensates the buyer through proration. So we're not going to go through all of them, but just know that those are things that are noted in the purchase agreement, and then they happen at closing.
Don, there's a couple more questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you. I see a
Mhm.
question from Brian Green. Would you typically ask for enough cash from the seller to cover payroll and current accounts possible? I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more, working capital, as we go along here. But Brian, the answer to your question is, in most small business sales, it's the buyer's responsibility to bring the operating cash for everything that they take over following closing. So it would be the seller's responsibility to pay payroll up to closing, and the buyer pays payroll after closing, and they're bringing their own money to the table for that. They are not getting it from the seller. And the same thing for accounts payable. The seller pays off all the accounts payable up to closing, but the buyer takes over after that point. Okay.
And there's
Yes.
also a question from Cal Grant.
Didn't see that one. 1 second here. What are your thoughts on working with an SBA lender directly versus an SBA broker? Oh, that's a great question. So we originally had a little bit about SBA financing in this program. We took it out because it was just too long, too much. We work with both of them, and we can make some recommendations to you on lenders and SBA brokers that we work with. There are advantages to disadvantages to both. An SBA lender specifically works with their institution and only their institution. And so they may or may not be the right lender. For example, some SBA lenders don't like to do restaurants or don't like to do construction businesses, things like that. And so while others, that's an area of strength for them. An SBA broker tends to have their hands out with multiple lenders. And so they know where to place a business based on the type of business that it is, and a size of business, geography, things like that. So we're not adverse to working with SBA brokers so long as they're good. As a brokerage, we tend to only want to work with brokers or lenders that we have experience with and that we are comfortable can take a transaction to the finish line and really fulfill that. So we're looking more for experience than we are for type. Okay, let's talk about asset. I hope that answered your question, Brian. Let's talk about assets to transfer. What is going to be included in the purchase agreement? These likely have been covered in some detail in the letter of intent, but tangible physical assets, vehicles, equipment, fixtures, leasehold improvements, supplies, inventory. Those are all physical assets that are going to transfer from the seller to the buyer. And they're also going to transfer intangible assets, all of the trade names, websites, social media, customer lists, email lists, phone numbers, financial records. These are all like the little operating components that are baked into how the business does its day-to-day activities. So all of these things are going to transfer. And then there's exclusions. So I can think of two places that are just really obvious exclusions. One, the seller of a business has a couple of personal cars. They're not used in the daily functions of the business, unlike, say, a delivery van might be. And so the seller wants to keep those. Very common exclusion from a business. Another one might be that this business is 95% based around a particular activity. And then there's this little side hustle or side business that the seller has where they like to operate. The buyer's not going to want that. The seller's going to want to retain that. It's not in competition with with what the main components of the business are. So that little side business might be excluded. And those are kinds of things that and there might be some inventory that goes with that, or another website that goes with that. So we see those as assets to transfer. I want to talk about the difference between assets to transfer and, on this next slide, purchase price allocation. A lot of people aren't familiar with the purchase price allocation, especially if you come from looking at it as a way a real estate transaction would. So in a real estate transaction, you're paying $1 million for the building, and that's what you're getting, and everything that's in the building. In a business transfer, you're paying $1 million for a variety of components that each have a value assigned to them. And this comes from the IRS. I'll jump down to the bottom of the slide and talk about the IRS Form 8594. It gets filled out and it's filed by the buyer and seller in every business transaction. And it must match. The buyer and seller copies must match. So that form is going to talk about what you're looking above it. If they don't match, if buyer and seller were to make changes or file different versions of that, it could trigger an audit, and that's the last thing you want to have to deal with. So just understand that every business has an allocation of price. What are those categories? The number one category is inventory. So that's those goods that are sold by companies that have goods to sell. Now, if you're a service business and you do office cleaning, you don't have goods to sell, although you might have some cleaning products as an inventory. But if you're a retail store or you're a distributor, you're going to have a certain amount of inventory. And so you need to describe what in the contract, what is the methodology? How's that going to be valued? Because, for example, inventory that's been sitting on the shelf for 5 years and isn't going to move for another 5 years doesn't have any value to a buyer, whereas current saleable marketing inventory does. There's a target amount. In this transaction, $100,000 of inventory will be included in the purchase price. When will that be calculated? We used to see inventory will be counted one day before closing to validate that the inventory is there. More often than not, we're now seeing that buyer and seller are going to be working together a bit after the closing. And so rather than try and fit that in when there's so many other things going on, it's sometimes better to have the closing and then have an adjustment made afterwards. What you want to find out is if there's $125,000 in valid inventory, then the buyer should pay the seller for the $25,000 in inventory they are getting over and above the selling price. And if there's $90,000 in inventory, the price of the business should be reduced because there's not as much inventory as was targeted in the purchase agreement. Okay, that's inventory. Tangible assets, furniture, fixtures, and equipment. Putting a value on all those things we talked about: vehicles, computers, manufacturing equipment, retail store racks, all of those kinds of things. the tangible assets have to have a value associated with them. And, let's just make up a number and say it's going to be 100,000. So now you have 100,000 of methodology, 100,000 of inventory, 100,000 of tangible physical assets. What are intangible assets? How do you value those? Well, these last two bullets, intangible assets, the intellectual property, maybe you have great binders that tell you all the processes that are handled by the team as they go through putting products together, building them, or the recipes for a restaurant, things like that. Intellectual property, non-compete, training, franchise rights. And most of these are going to fit down in a category called goodwill. Non-compete and training are actually separate items that get valued. But what's interesting is you could have $1 million business with 100,000 in inventory and 100,000 in tangible assets and 800,000 in goodwill. That's common. And we see that that the SBA lenders are willing to finance goodwill. And so it's important to recognize goodwill is a reasonable component. I'm not going to get into the details, but there are reasons why you may not want to allocate tangible assets higher than what they're really worth in their current market value, in their condition. Okay, let's look at an example of an allocation. I sort of just talked about it. $1 million total price, 100,000 inventory, 100,000 furniture, fixtures, and equipment. Small amount given to the non-compete, small amount given to the training. By the way, if there is a non-compete in your purchase agreement, it has to be valued. If there is training in your purchase agreement, it has to be valued. It doesn't have to be valued for a lot, but it has to be valued, and that's going to show up on the 8594 IRS form, and 790,000 in goodwill. So that's an allocation. Let's look at the tax obligations that go with that obligation. Sellers, you are going to pay taxes, and you're going to pay taxes on these asset allocations at different levels. Goodwill is the lowest tax rate for you because it is at long-term capital gains. Furniture, fixtures, and equipment on the difference between the depreciated value on the balance sheet and the allocation that's in the purchase agreement, you are going to pay that at ordinary income rates, which tends to be higher than long-term capital gains. So just know that how you allocate the business is going to impact your tax obligations as a seller, and you're going to want to get with your CPA because you're going to want the deal terms, the purchase agreement, to reflect the most favorable taxes for you to the best you can. Tax obligations, for example, sales taxes, employee taxes, payroll taxes, and the things, those transfer with business ownership if they're not dealt with at closing. Buyers, this is just a heads up of all of the things that you want to have dealt with at closing. You want the seller's tax liabilities to be taken care of in the purchase agreement and in the closing so that they don't transfer to you, which is how the government entities that are receiving taxes will handle it. They will have it follow the assets. So just be careful, protect yourself. As seller, you're going to own those tax obligations, obviously, up to closing, and how you're going to take care of those needs to be reflected in the purchase agreement. Tax payments are often in arrears and need a settlement value. I'll give you an example. Personal property taxes are paid at the end of the year, but the business might sell in June. That means the buyer is going to be in charge of paying a whole year's worth of personal property taxes. So the seller needs to reimburse them for the half a year. And usually that's handled at the closing. So there's a settlement value associated with that. Okay, what else is there? There are debts and yes.
Sorry, Don, there's just a couple more questions in the chat.
Okay, let's see here. Oh, I see what's going on here. I'm getting them in reverse order.
Uh-oh.
Let's see.
So it's from Brian, and my chat isn't working well either. Would you
Oh, here we go.
you got
This
it?
is a good one. Brian, I see the question now. I'm scrolling down. Is it better for the buyer to have a higher value on tangible assets for a higher amount to depreciate over time? Absolutely, Brian. It is better for the buyer to have a higher value on tangible assets so you can depreciate it over time. Oops. Here's the other side of the coin. And Don talked about how everything's a negotiation. It's better for the seller to have a lower value on tangible assets because they have to pay that depreciation recapture tax, which is at a higher level. And going beyond your ability to depreciate, in most transactions, depending on where they take place, it's going to be the buyer's responsibility to immediately pay sales tax on the assets that they are acquiring, the physical assets. So if you're putting a value of 50,000 on those physical assets and you're in Boulder, you're going to have $5,000 in sales tax due as the buyer for you to get a business license from the city of Boulder. They're very clever about withholding that if you haven't paid the sales tax on the assets that you acquire. However, if you put the value of those assets in the allocation at 250,000, you're going to have 25,000 due at closing. So it's a balancing act for the buyer between the ability to depreciate and the ability to pay those sales taxes. Also keep in mind, you can also depreciate goodwill, but you can only depreciate goodwill over 15 years, which isn't as fast as you can depreciate your physical assets. But you can depreciate all of the goodwill. If you're going to own the business for a long period of time, if that's your intention, you will get to it. Hopefully that answered your question, Brian. Let's go to debts and loans. In an asset purchase agreement, you're getting the assets. Don Taylor once described this. You're getting the good stuff, not the bad stuff. Debts is the bad stuff, right? So debts need to be retired and paid off by the seller. That needs to be noted in the contract, and it's taken care of at closing. Buyer is not going to assume liabilities for outstanding debts. PPP, we used to see a lot of PPP loans that were in place. It's a declining issue. However, we still see them occasionally. If they've been forgiven, then there's nothing to worry about. You just need to have proof that they've been forgiven. And you want to note that in your purchase agreement. So debts and loans do not transfer to the buyer. They are the responsibility of the seller, and the purchase agreement needs to show how to do that. Purchase agreement is also want to address some questions about employees. So along the way, doing the due diligence, I always say the hardest question first. During the due diligence process, what did the buyer learn? What has the seller shared? And is there any possibility that an employee is going to need to be terminated as part of this transaction happening? If so, it's really better that that employee is terminated by the seller and not by the new buyer. Why? The new buyer doesn't want their first action to be terminating employees, right? But if there's been a meeting of the minds between the buyer and the seller about changes to be made, it's really it's best if the seller can do that. Maybe there is a key employee retention plan that's going to include bonuses for that employee to stay on. And maybe the buyer and seller have come to a meeting of the minds that the seller is going to offer a bonus, let's say $1,000 at closing to these employees, and the buyer is going to offer an additional bonus of $2,500 if after 30 days those employees are still there. If there is a plan like that that's developed during the due diligence phase, you want to put it in the contract, in the purchase agreement, so everybody knows. Employee notification plan. How are employees going to be notified? Maybe they're going to be notified after the fact. Hey, employees, just want to let you know you have a new owner of this business. Maybe they're going to be notified in advance. There's no right answer. Every business is different. Every seller's different. Every buyer's different. You negotiate something that's going to work out. You put it in the contract so everybody knows what's going to work on. Payroll transition. Most common that we're seeing today is sellers pay up through the day of closing, buyers take over. We do see times, however, where it's just easier. It's 3 days until payroll period. It's just easier to continue doing payroll the way it was being done and then have a settlement, because the seller would be paying 3 days of the buyer's ownership. So the buyer would need to compensate the seller for those 3 days. Whatever the plan is, get it in the contract. Employee raises before closing. This is a no-no, sellers. Don't just give out raises after you've got a buyer who thinks the profitability is going to be X, but by giving raises, you've decreased that, and now the profitability is only Y. You want to have a clause in there that says no employee raises after the purchase agreement is signed, and deal with that. Or have a clause that says, yes, Mary is going to get a raise of $1,000 a month. And everybody knows that that's going to happen. You want to deal with any employee benefits and bonus plans that are going to be taken on by the buyer. Seller, you'll need to share what they are. Buyers are typically going to want to continue those. Why? They don't want to come in and be the bad guy to discontinue these benefit plans on day one. So they're typically going to want to continue those. But how will those transition? You want to make sure that that's noted in the purchase agreement. Same thing for employee policies for vacation, illness. You're going to want to take care of those. So we're starting, you can see, we're really taking care in the purchase agreement. We're really taking care of the details. We're making sure that everything that needs to be understood is understood so we can go to closing and do it. Okay, let's talk about possession. How is the buyer going to actually get this business? Is it going to transfer on the day of closing? Or is it going to transfer 30 days after closing? Is there going to be some delay in SBA lender funding? So it's not going to close until that SBA lender, or it's not going to transition, even though it closed, it's not going to actually transition. It's not going to take effect until that SBA lender money comes through. So every deal's different. There's different factors that get involved here. Brokers are knowledgeable. They can help you, take care of this and make sure the language is correct. But you want to specify that in the purchase agreement. Typically, it's 12:01 a.m. on the day of closing, meaning buyer owns the day of closing, which means buyer's going to own and be responsible for all the payroll and all the rent and all the things that are due. Even though they might not have closed till 2 in the afternoon, they actually calculate everything based on 12:01 a.m. And hey, if there are keys to this business, it's a wonderful thing. You dangle those keys and you hand them over, seller to buyer, and say, this baby's yours, enjoy it, and you can let yourself in because you got your own key. Okay, representations and warranties. This is all legal stuff. I don't really want to spend too much time going through it, but I just want to say, difference between the LOI. LOI doesn't have any representations and warranties in it. The purchase agreement does. Are you in good standing with the state government? Do you have the authority to enter this transaction? Are you the rightful owner, right? Who are the brokers getting involved and what are the fees that people get paid? Yes, this is what the lease is. Material facts that might need to be disclosed. There could be environmental facts. Maybe this is an auto repair shop, and there's some material fact about what existed on that property before, and how that might impact environmental evaluations. Are there any legal claims or not? Are there any product liabilities that would carry over to a new person? All of these things, need to be included in a purchase agreement. And you'll get a copy of this slide deck plus what we're talking about today. So I think it's important to that you'll have this list and you'll be able to include it, but this is where you want to go. And brokers pay a lot of attention to it, but who really pays attention to it is that person I call the advocate attorney for the buyer or the seller. And you each have one. And if they're good, they won't let this get past them. You also want, information about how this can be terminated and what happens if it is, indemnification, conduct of business to closing. Sellers, your most important responsibility through all of this is to keep that business humming along. You are responsible for making sure that when you turn over to the business, it was as strong at closing as it was when the buyers were first looking at this before the letter of intent. So you have many months of keeping that business going. Confidentiality, timeliness, cooperation, all of these things are boilerplate. And there's even more when we go to the next slide, right? Entire agreement, definitions of what all the terms mean, governing law. Is it state of Colorado? Is it Boulder County? Is it Larimer County? Fees and expenses, all of these things, it's going to get included. This stuff isn't sexy, but it's what helps you resolve problems if something goes wrong. All of these representations and warranties almost always relate back to what's going to happen if something goes wrong versus the business terms, which you enter into because you think they're going to go right. And so you're willing to purchase the business because of what's going right with it versus what's going wrong. And so at the end of the day, there's a purchase agreement, and that purchase agreement is going to be signed and executed by both parties. And now you have something in place that allows you to move forward to the closing, where Don Taylor comes back in and takes us through it.
Okay, friends. So that anxiety that you're feeling right now, having survived an hour and 15 minutes with two business brokers walk you through contracts and letters of intent and all this stuff, this is how you feel when we get close to closing too, right? We've done all this work. We spent all this time together. We've written checks and my goodness, I mean, everything that goes into it. And now we're heading to close. And you know what, Don? Closing is sexy. So we're going to dive into closing and get this deal done. So this is the legal transfer from the seller to the buyer. Okay. The closing process is very detailed. And if you like checklists, you're going to love this. And if you have a loan, well, you're really going to have fun because you're going to have multiple checklists that are going to help ensure everything is taken care of. Critical piece of this slide here, closing attorney with experience. I can't emphasize that enough. Competence is critical. It's a critical success factor to a secure and complete transaction. Everybody needs it. Seller, buyer, the lender, all the people involved. The landlord's going to be affected by it if they exist in this situation. But closing attorneys, I mean, that's most common what Don and I work with: buyer attorney, seller attorney, and closing attorney. We can answer questions offline more about that if you need some help or referrals. But the buyer and seller will agree on that person, and they typically split the costs of doing that. Typically the buyer or seller attorney says, well, I can do that. It's just add that to my bill. And then we'll send them the closing checklist of it's 92 line items. It's 11 sections. And they normally say, no, please have that closing attorney do that. But they're going to tackle things like UCC lien searches, and they're paying, getting payoff statements, whatever the debts are that need to be settled at closing. They're going to handle that. They're going to check property taxes and maybe take care of that too. and they're going to deal with the entities. They're coordinating with the lender. If the lender exists, which they almost always do, they're receiving money into their escrow accounts and in wires and checks and all this, and then sending money out to all the parties that are being paid and compensated or paid off. Lots of documents are being prepared. Okay, closing instructions, settlement statements, which is really critical. If you buy and sell a home, you're used to seeing something like that. Those exist here. We're going to need to see that 4 or 5 days in advance, as early as possible, so everybody knows exactly what they're paying, what they're getting. But the closing attorney is going to resolve the entities, right? Where one person is letting go of something, and the next person is buying it, and we have to transfer it from party A to party B. There's a lot going on there. The closing attorney is going to take care of that too. They're going to deal with the bills of sales if there's vehicles involved, all the assignments, that are part of that. They'll make sure that the non-competition agreement is signed and in place. If there's a seller note, that promissory note, they're going to take care of that, tied together with a security agreement. Personal property taxes, Don mentioned that earlier. How's that going to be handled? Does it need to be prorated?
Hey, Don, let me just,
Yeah.
got a quick question here.
Yeah.
Great question from Cal. What are the typical closing costs as a percentage of a deal? So Cal, interestingly, they typically aren't a percentage of a deal. Some deals are more complicated and cost more, but I'm gonna throw out a generalized number. A closing attorney with experience who's done it before will probably charge in the range of $3,000 to $6,000 to handle closing. All these things that Don is talking about get handled in a really professional way. And for my money, even at the $6,000 level or less, certainly, it's the best value in the entire transaction, because it is nailing down every loose end that could come to haunt you after the fact gets taken care of. And they're pros, and you really want to go with them. But 3,000 to 6,000 split 2 ways, so 1,500 to 3,000 a piece. That's common.
Yeah, Don, are there more questions that we need to tackle while we're here?
Do we have attorney referrals with that experience? Absolutely, contact us. We would be happy to share that with you.
Lenders.
And what side typically does the initial legwork getting the specific details of a sale for a contract? Great question, and we probably weren't clear enough on it. Both the letter of intent and the purchase agreement are documents that come from the buyer to the seller. So the initial legwork on both documents is done by the buyer. The broker can help the buyer with templates for the LOI and the purchase agreement, not just an empty template that you fill in the blanks like the Colorado real estate form, but one that is actually crafted to reflect the business terms of that specific deal, who the parties are, who's involved. All of those things would show up in a purchase agreement template, which a buyer can then take to their attorney. However, I'll also add, there are a lot of attorneys who have their own templates that they're very proud of, and they want to use their own templates. And so a lot of times that's where it starts from.
Yeah. Awesome.
I'm going to let Don roll through his final slides before any more questions, because we only have 10 minutes. I just want to make sure we get to the finish line.
Well, we're heading towards Champaign, so I'm going to get us there quick.
Okay.
So where do these closings, where do they occur, right? Typically at the closing agent office, that's very common. We work with several, and a lot of them have a nice environment. I mean, look, this is supposed to be fun. There's a tremendous amount of work that's been done, and it's serious, and we have to sign, we have to make sure all the T's and the I's, everything is dialed in. But it's also a celebration of all the work and effort that's come together. Hopefully our buyers and sellers are really getting along, and they're excited about what's next. So it can be done at their office. These can be done remotely. Sometimes the closing attorney is portable. They might be able to go, you know, to a third party location. But at the end of the day, they just have to be able to do their job. They have to, there's an administrative component to it. Yep, we need a table and there's people sitting around, but we're faxing and we're scanning and we're signing. And sometimes there's last minute changes, and that you know, the buyer and seller attorney are on call. If they're not physically present, they may have to make adjustments, but they're going to provide notary services for the transaction and some administrative support as needed to get the deal across the finish line. They're going to distribute funds. We talked earlier, they're receiving them, they're sending them. You've got a copy of the slide. This is just some examples of all the part of the work they're doing just in that piece. And filings, right? So not only are they dealing with money, but they're dealing with contracts and they're filing documents. This is what it goes back to. Make sure you have somebody that knows what they're doing. Secure, complete transaction competence is key. And we made it, Don, to the celebration. We got our deal closed. We made it through closing, everything signed. The seller's been paid. The buyer is you know, a lot lighter in their checkbook at this point now. And now after the champagne, they get to go to work.
Yeah,
You
it's
do have
a,
another quick question in the chat.
yeah. Let's see. I think from Brian, do you ever see a buyer asking the seller for some amount of operating cash? Sure. But let me tell you how in small business we tend to structure that. Small business sales, that cash that you're talking about, operating cash or working capital is another name for it. In small business sales, it is almost always, as I said earlier, the responsibility of the buyer to have that working capital over and above the price paid to acquire the business. Okay, that said, in small business sales, one of the ways that that's frequently handled is that the SBA lender might provide the working capital and wrap that in as part of their loan to acquire the business, because the SBA lender recognizes that there's no way a buyer can operate that business if they don't have the working capital to get it done. And so one of the things lenders analyze is what are the working capital requirements and where are those coming from? And they'll get involved in that. So that might come from the lender. It could also come from the buyer, you know, if they have those resources available. It might come from the seller. As a general rule, if there is a working capital request from the buyer, it is added to the negotiated price, and the transaction now has a new price for price of the business plus working capital and a new allocation added in there. We had inventory, we had FF&E, non-compete, training, goodwill. Now there'd be another category added to that allocation called working capital or cash that's included in the business and recorded on that 8594 form. So yes, we see them asking, but there is a good question. Why are you asking for this? Are you asking for it because you don't otherwise have the money? Does that impact your strength as a buyer? Or are you asking for it for some other, you know, reason? So yes, they do, but it's not typically included in the price. Okay, some takeaways really fast here. Number one, LOI. It's not a toe in the water. It's not a trial balloon. By the time you submit an LOI, going all the way back to the beginning of this, you're really making a commitment to purchase. The contingencies are in there for material issues or for problems that can't be resolved as this transaction moves forward. But if those don't emerge as problems, the expectation from the beginning is you're wanting to buy this business. And I can tell you, if you're a buyer and you come to the table, the broker's going to hold your feet to the fire, and they're going to make you prove that you're capable, willing, and that your intentions are to go to the finish line. And that's going to be part of the strength of your offer in competition with others. Sellers are then going to pick through those offers, dissect them, meet the buyers, do whatever they need to do on their side to choose one buyer who's strongest. and they will enter into one letter of intent, not two parallel LOIs moving forward, one. So buyers, this is your chance to become the leading candidate in the horse race to get this business. However, it is still non-binding. So we're trying to get to the APA, to that purchase agreement, as quickly as possible, because really the seller is still holding all the risk when all they have is a non-binding agreement in front of them. Seller mitigates their risk when they get a purchase agreement done. So keep those in mind. Okay. At the purchase agreement level, it is a legally binding document. Everybody's locked in. Elon Musk was locked in, and you're going to be locked in. It really does move this into the 99% certainty the deal is moving forward. Hey, this is life. We've all seen the variabilities of life, but there shouldn't be anything that impacts this transaction in the normal course of business. The purchase agreement is the playbook. You saw all the things that happen at closing. All of those happen at closing because of what we've detailed in the purchase agreement. It's specified everything that's going to happen, where the money's going to go, what the companies are going to be called, what the filings are going to be with the state, all of that stuff. Use a capable attorney. Don't bring a divorce attorney in. Don't bring an estate attorney in. And for goodness sakes, don't bring a high-level mergers and acquisitions attorney to the table to buy a small business. They're going to turn it into a 3-month-long exercise costing you tons of money because they're treating it much larger than it is. This is a simple transaction between buyer and seller for a small business. That's complicated enough. Don't add that other level of thinking it's a $50 million transaction when it's not. Watch out for the error of omission. Don't leave something out if you can. Okay. Closing. Experienced attorney. Scope of work. There's a contract with that closing attorney that says, what are they going to provide? Make sure that that contract specifies what you're going to get. And brokers can be very helpful with you in that. Mutual agreement of buyer, seller on the attorney. Hey, I'm fine with the closing attorney being either a buyer or a seller attorney and doubling up as a closing attorney, so long as they're experienced, because it's a separate engagement. It's a neutral party engagement with buyer and seller. They're not advocating for anyone. They're advocating for the transaction to be handled properly, not for the buyer or seller to win or lose. Get those documents in advance for review because you're going to find things that are wrong with them. Disbursement of funds may be delayed if not received in advance and cleared. Everybody should get ready for the fact you don't necessarily walk out of closing with a check. It might take a while to get the lender's fund in, 24 hours, 48 hours. And then for the escrow attorney to be comfortable dispersing that because they fully cleared the banking system, which is a little bit complicated. Okay.
Thanks so much, Don and Don. This series has been amazing, and even I have learned so much, and each time I listen to you both. So thanks so much for being here, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We appreciate it.